Okay, good afternoon. I'm Janice, Bially, Mattern. I'm a professor here at NUS, and I am the academic convener of the Global Studies program. What I am here to tell you about today is our new major, about which we are all very excited. So I want to introduce it to you today by saying something that you've all probably heard before. Globalization is making the world a smaller place. Okay, what do we mean by that? We've all heard it, but what exactly does it mean? Well, one possibility is that the world is literally shrinking. And in fact, this is true. Ocean levels are rising, land mass is disappearing because of climate change, and climate change is in important part a result of globalization. That's one possibility. Another possibility that we mean when we talk about the world shrinking is that the time-space continuum is being compressed. Right? The world is getting smaller because globalizing technologies are allowing us to move information and ourselves and objects from point A to point B more quickly, and so distances are getting shorter across the Earth. Okay, those are all good ways of thinking about how globalization is making the world a smaller place, but for those of us in the arts and social sciences, when we say that the world is getting to be a smaller place, what we mean is that the world is shrinking socially. We mean that globalization involves a whole bunch of social practices that are not contained by national boundaries. These processes have brought people from all over the world together in ways that they haven't been before. So globalization is creating social connections that didn't exist before, pushing people together into what we might think of as global societies of a sort. This is the focus of global studies. Global studies is concerned with globalization, with the socially shrinking world, with the processes by which it is shrinking, and with what it means for us as peoples, as nations, as families, as businesses, as governments, as nonprofit organizations, as religious groups, as humankind of all levels of social life. That's what global studies studies. And I want to try to explain that to you a little bit more concretely today. In the process of doing that, I'm also going to describe for you the global studies major at NUS. And I'll spend a few minutes comparing the Global Studies major at NUS to other majors that might look similar to you, because of course the Global Studies major is brand new. And I will of course close with a quick word about the perennial question, what can I do with this degree when I'm done with university? Okay, so as I just said, Global Studies is concerned with globalization. It's concerned with the socially shrinking world and the implications of a socially shrinking world for us as people. How do you study that? That's a huge question. How do you even begin to approach that? Well, as a field, global studies is organized into three sub-inquiries. What is globalization? What are the implications of globalization for humankind, that is, for us as people? And what can we do to manage the implications of globalization to the advantage of humankind? So, I guess the idea here will be to take each of these in turn in a process giving you a sense of what we'd be doing in this major. The first one, what is globalization? Now, on some level, this should be a fairly simple question. Most of us have some idea of what we think globalization is. We think of it primarily as an economic process by which markets are gradually integrated into a single global economy. And the story here is that people all around the world are increasingly social connected through global practices like international commerce, trade, and finance. And the more global these economic practices get, the more socially interconnected we become. And that's all right. That's true, it's correct, but it is not all that globalization includes. Economic practices are not the only practices that have gone global. There are other kinds of practices that have spread around the world and that are connecting people globally. For instance, migration, right? The practice of moving around the world has become a global phenomenon in everywhere that is connecting people around the world in ways that it hasn't before. Similarly, the practice of emitting carbon into the atmosphere. That practice used to be concentrated primarily on a few advanced industrialized countries, but increasingly it's global. It's a practice that people engage with everywhere. And as that practice goes global, so do we have in global environmental challenges that are pushing people together around the world as they face the challenge of trying to preserve our environment for future generations. So what I'm getting at here is that one of the key aims of global studies is to take stock of these kinds of global practices that I've just mentioned as examples. So this includes describing these practices, like global migration, like the degradation of the environment, and so on. But it also includes examining how these practices are connected to each other. And this is important within the field of global studies because it means that researchers go about the basic empirical research of figuring out what constitutes globalization and how practices of globalization are connected to each other through basic empirical research, that is, fact-based knowledge. So one part of the global studies major is to provide our students with an education in this fact-based knowledge about the particular practices that are moving globalization. We do this, first of all, through an exposure module that gives you a full survey of the various practices involved in globalization, or what I might call globalizing forces, gives you an overview of these. And based on what you learn in this exposure module, we then direct you to focus first on a theme. When I say a theme, I mean a cluster of particular globalizing forces that interested you the most as you took this exposure module. So what you see here is our 10 themes as they are currently formulated. I'm saying as they are currently formulated because these themes are clusters of globalizing practices. But globalization is an ongoing complex process, which means that the practices that move it are going to change over time. As those change, so will our themes. In the meantime, if you come in next year, after you are done with your Global Studies Exposure module, you will select a theme in which to focus your studies in order to get a concrete handle on one particular aspect of globalization. I can return to these themes later if you have questions on them. But for now, the point is that students both get a broad perspective on globalization, and then they are asked to concentrate more directly on a particular theme. The modules in which you are educated in the substantive stuff of your particular theme are taken across different departments and disciplines in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. So this is a multidisciplinary major for reasons that I will explain a bit later. Okay, the other thing that happens, and the other way that we educate you in the substantive stuff of globalization, is that you are asked at this point as well to select a regional focus. We're asking you to learn about globalization, which is an enormous thing with multiple complex processes, but we're telling you you can also focus in on one. We're asking you to consider the effects of globalization for humankind, but we're telling you that in addition to doing that, we'll let you focus in on a particular region of humankind, okay? Which makes some sense because who can master the world? Okay, and this is what the region is for. It allows you to concretize what you learn about your theme in a particular place. And again, the modules that you take in relation to your region are from across different disciplines in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. So the idea here is that global studies majors are educated both broadly and deeply on the first question, what is globalization? So the second question, sorry, I've gotten ahead of myself. The second question of global studies probes more deeply into the social implications of globalization. And here the question regards whether and how global societies that are forged by global practices are actually affecting how we live. So here the question is, does the fact that we are connected to each other globally actually matter? So what if we are all being increasingly globally connected? Does it matter for what we do? Does it matter, for instance, for the way our governments govern us? Does it matter that there are global societies forged around particular issues for instance, the way wealth is distributed around the world? Does it matter that there are global societies for how we practice our day-to-day local customs, right? Now, you might want to be wondering at this point, why would I suspect that a global society would matter for our day-to-day life? And the answer here is a distinctly social science and humanities answer. The answer is that I and other people interested in global studies approach the world with the presumption that humans are social animals. Everything about us is conditioned by the other human beings to whom we are connected in our local settings and around the world. Everything, the most basic things from how we dress, how we talk, what we want, who we marry, who we don't marry, how we live our lives, the things that we desire, our goals and objectives, all the way to complex things like how we set up our governments and how we fathom our ethical responsibilities. So ask yourself this question: in what way are my interests, my identities, my ideas, my goals, my objectives, my interest in attending university shaped by the societies within which I'm embedded, shaped by my family, shaped by my life as a member of the Singapore national community? I'm asking these questions because if globalization is enveloping us in global societies, it's possibly then also shaping us, our values, our identities, our interests, our desires. It's also possibly shaping our leaders, our government leaders, our business leaders, our religious leaders, the organizations and communities of which we are a part, right? Global society, in other words, could be affecting us in the same way any of our societies do, affecting humankind in all of its varied social forms and its varied levels of life. And this is the concern, the second concern of global studies. So researchers who are interested in this very big question go about their work through what I would call a global analysis, right? And when I talk about global analysis, I mean a technique for thinking globally or holistically about the concrete effects of global societies on people in all of these various ways. Not just specific individuals, but all kinds of human collectivities at all levels of social life, groups, organizations, countries, families. So for instance, you can use a global analysis, or there has been very good global analytic research that demonstrates how the practice of global migration has changed the structure of family life, has changed the structure of individual interests and desires, has changed the way that countries imagine the importance of different languages in their national identity, has changed patterns of violence, conflict, and reconciliation between different social groups, right? So in this way, migration has affected all kinds of implications for how we live our life as human beings. And global analysis is the tool by which we evaluate and arrive at these conclusions. Okay. And this then is what the second part of the global studies major aims to accomplish. It aims to provide our students with exposure to and training in these global analytic methods. It does this through our core modules, which both continue to emphasize breadth and provide students with holistic analytic tools and techniques. And second, by giving students an intensive language training in the language that is pertinent to the theme and region that they focused upon. This helps refine your analytic perspective. For those of you who were here for the last presentation, the discussion centered on the importance of having a holistic perspective on complex problems, but also on being anchored in particular knowledge. And this is what's happening in this portion of our major. Okay, so the third question of global studies is a more practical one. So the first question, if you recall, was descriptive. What is globalization? The second one was explanatory and analytical. How is it affecting us? In what ways? Who is it affecting? At what levels of social life? This third problem involves problem solving and policy-oriented plans for action, right? So here the question is, given what we know about how globalization and the global societies that it is generating are shaping us, given what we've learned by performing global analysis, what can we now say about the kinds of opportunities and problems that are created by globalization and global societies? And what can we do to harness the opportunities and solve these problems that are provoked? So let's return then for a moment to this example. I mentioned one thing that we know is that migration has both tied people together around the world, creating certain kinds of global communities, but we also know that it provokes conflicts, new patterns of conflicts, and in many cases, violence, right? What can be done to manage this? What can be done by dialing all the way back to the basic issue of migration? Can we make suggestions about how to manage migration policy that will help ameliorate the problem of violence? Or are there conflict management strategies that governments can put in place, whatever their migration policies are? Can advocacy organizations or private companies contribute to facilitating intercultural communication between migrant communities and those who are indigenous to a region? These are the kinds of problem-solving questions that become possible when you have a holistic perspective. These are also questions that I want to underscore, raise large ethical issues about how to be just and how to organize our societies in ethical and just ways, given the emergence of global societies. How can we craft global societies so that they don't detract from, but instead enrich our local lives? Okay, in any case, the point here is that the emphasis of the third focus of global studies is on problem solving, policy, and action. It's about moving from analysis and explanation to prescription and what we can do. And this, therefore, is the final focus of the way our major is constructed. During the third and fourth years of our major, fourth years being for the students that go on through the honors program, students are required to take particular core modules in which they bring the global analytic skills that they've learned together with their substantive expertise in theme and region to try to solve a policy-oriented problem. Okay, so in the third year, this takes the form of a module that's going to be called Method and Inquiry. And in the fourth year, this takes the form of a year-long project that we can call for short task force. So what happens here is that in both cases, students work in teams to solve a concrete problem that's caused by some specific aspect of globalization. In the third year, they do this sort of in-house. I invent a problem that's related to your theme and region. You solve it. And that follows on a series of weeks in which we refine your analytic techniques and methods. So the problem is purely fictional, and it comes from the mind of your educators. In the case of the fourth year, right, this becomes a year-long project in which you pursue this kind of policy-oriented solution in connection with some organization out there in the real world to whom you are linked for real. So this may be a government agency, this may be an international organization, this may be a nonprofit NGO, it may be a religious group, but it is some organization that is having some real-world difficulty related to globalization that it needs a resolution to. And in this case, you work with your team to develop a solution that you then present to the organization with whom you are twinned at the end of the year. Okay, so you've got your sort of what are the implications of this big holistic education honed down into these final year experiences. All right. So in sum, the field of global studies centers on three questions. What is globalization? What are its implications for how humans live? And what can we do about it? And each is pursued through particular aspects of the major. And this is what it all looks like when you pull it together. So all that you're seeing here, and I won't go into the nitty-gritty details of this with you, although I'm happy to discuss it if you have questions. What you're seeing here is the layout of the core modules that I've mentioned. These core modules are very important because, and by the way, coded GL for global studies. Not sure how that happened, but that's what it means. Global studies is GL. Coded GL, because they are taught in the Global Studies program by Global Studies professors who are dedicated professors in this program. This, by the way, includes the Honor Year Task Force, which is coupled with this first semester readings in global issues. Okay, so these are taught inside the Global Studies majors. The theme, region, and language that I mentioned are all drawn from a multidisciplinary menu of options where each theme is correlated to a set of modules across FASS that are appropriate to or pertain to that theme, and the same thing with the region. And language is taught through our language center. Okay. So I'm happy to say more about this later, but as long as you have this general scheme for understanding the major, I guess I'd like at this point to dial out a bit, because this is a complicated arrangement, right? This is not what you expect when you look at your bulletin and say, here's what I need to do. It's not easy all the time to think, why would I need such a complicated arrangement of multidisciplinary classes coupled with strange new holistic methods of analysis? And I want to acknowledge that this looks pretty confusing. So perhaps you want to think the question here, do we need all this? Do we really need this newfangled major? Can't I learn about globalization and its effects on people by majoring in something that's a little bit more familiar, a little bit more tried and tested, something like sociology, economics, political science, history, geography, and so on? I mean, these days, every single one of the majors in FASS are concerned with globalization and its human effects. And that is true, right? But they're not concerned with it in the same way that globalization, that global studies is. And the difference in how they are concerned with it leads to a difference in the kind of education you get and in the kinds of career-relevant skills that you acquire. So to show you what I mean here, I'm going to do a little comparison. I'm going to compare global studies to international relations. Now, I'm picking international relations because it's part of the field of political science, and I am a political science PhD, so I know a bit about political science. I'm also picking international relations because it is the single field of inquiry that students most frequently associate with global studies. It is the closest you can get to global studies. But it's a lot more familiar because it happens within the field of within the discipline of political science. All right, so let's consider the differences, starting first with the core concern, right? As I've said, the core concern of global studies is to understand globalization and its human effects. The core concern of international relations is the same as the core concern of all areas of political science, which is to understand how governance works. Fair enough, okay? Therefore, given these differences, global studies is analytically focused on the themes that we've just discussed, right? The practices of globalization and the global human relations that they create, whereas international relations is analytically focused on those who have the authority and power to govern, right? If we're interested in how governance works, we need to focus on those who have the authority and power to govern, and we need to understand how they get along with each other. And in the context of international relations, this means states or countries, the governments that run countries, and the relationships between them. Okay. This already tells us an awful lot about why you cannot actually get a decent education about globalization and its human effects by majoring in political science, even if you focus on international relations. I'm saying this because what you see here is that international relations is concerned with interstate relations. It is not concerned with globalization. Globalization interests it only insofar as it affects the way that governments or states relate to each other, and that's not insignificant. That's important stuff. But what it doesn't do is teach you anything about globalization per se. What you will learn about is not migration, how it evolved, why it became global, what works, what doesn't work, why its patterns are the way that they are. Instead, you will take migration as a global phenomenon for granted, and you will look at how it affects interstate relations. Okay. So what does that tell you? It tells you that international relations can't actually tell you anything about globalization because it doesn't have the breadth of knowledge. It is, like all discipline-based inquiries, disciplinary in the information that it has. It doesn't have information about what migration or what carbon emissions practices are, because, like all disciplines, political science, sociology, geography, you name it, economics, they interpret the world through a disciplined reference point. And in the case of political science and international relations, the reference point is whether or not the phenomenon in question matters for interstate relations. The phenomenon in question, globalization in this case, is outside the domain of concern because the discipline has disciplined it out of the domain of concern. Okay? The problem here is that globalization cannot be understood through a single disciplinary perspective because, as I've already indicated, there's a whole complex of practices that make it work. 10 by our count right now, but surely more, right? So globalization is so complex that it really can't be adequately understood through any single multidisciplinary lens, which is why we are multidisciplinary. We give you more perspectives, and that's why we're able to teach you about globalization where you wouldn't learn that in political science. Okay. The other reason that you can already see that you're not going to learn much about globalization and its human effects by majoring in political science in this case is because to the extent that political science is able to talk to you about the human effects of globalization, it does so by thinking about human effects through states. States are the containers by which human life is organized on this view of the world, and that is all good and fine to have what I'm calling here a state-centric analytic perspective. But the whole point about globalization is that it is connecting human beings around the world in ways that sometimes completely circumvent the state. And so we're missing a huge chunk of the action if we try to consider how globalization is shaping or affecting human beings by focusing only on states, right? And this is why global studies takes a global analytic approach. Okay, and that's it. We take this global, holistic, analytic orientation so that we can capture more of the dimensions of human life that are affected by globalization or its various practices. So my point here is simply, yes, we really do need this complex interdisciplinary major. All right, final question, what can I do with this degree? Well, I want to start by noting that global studies majors are like all FASS majors in very important respects, which is that they will not have trouble getting jobs. Okay? Students educated in arts and social sciences are roundly sought out by government agencies, by firms in the private sector, by the nonprofit sector, by all kinds of organizations because they develop excellent critical thinking, independent critical thinking, and writing skills. But among FASS-agers, global studies majors are going to have additional distinctive career relevant skills. First, they're going to have these policy-relevant problem-solving skills that come through the efforts that happen in a third and fourth year core modules. Second, they're going to have this distinctive holistic perspective that allows you to make sense of the world without using only one single algorithm. Right? Multiple complex overlapping algorithms that give you a sense of what is happening that is not reductionist. And then, last of all, global studies students are going to develop expertise in not one, but 3 areas: their theme, their region, and a language. And we think that this is breadth and depth, a combination that works in a world that is increasingly complex, where employers are seeking creativity, flexibility, broad understanding, and expertise, because they really want it all. Okay. Thank you, and I'd love to entertain questions if there are any. At the booth. The questions at the booth, I'm told. Okay. Okay. Thank you.